Hello, and welcome to our first real lecture on the Mahabharata, the story of a great war and a great conflict. Today we'll be looking at the Adi and the Sabha Parvans. Those are the first two chapters of the Mahabharata. And one thing I'd like to remind you about the Mahabharata is that if you know these stories, specifically the ones I'm going to highlight today, you can pretty much talk to any Hindu about these stories, and they'll be really excited to do it. In my first trip to India, I'd done a little bit of studying of the Mahabharata, and I would sit and talk to old guys on trains, aunties at places I'd stay, temple priests, just sort of strike up conversations about different characters in the Mahabharata. First, they were surprised that I knew these stories, but then when we really got going, we found that we would pull out new understandings, new nuances to these tales just by talking through them. And I would say that while we're reading the Mahabharata in a book and watching a film adaptation of it, what we're where the Mahabharata really lives, where the story really lives, is when people are talking about it and exchanging these tales. And the best way to encounter it is with someone telling you that story. So from Doniger on page 263, we have a really nice, tight, concise summary of the text. So I'll read it to you. The 5 sons of King Pandu, who are called the Pandavas, were fathered by gods. Yudhishthira by Dharma, Bhima by the wind or Vayu, Arjuna by Indra, and the twins, who are by name of Nakula and Sahadeva, are fathered by the Ashwins. All 5 of them are married to a woman named Draupadi, the most beautiful woman who has ever existed. When Yudhishthira lost the kingdom to his cousins in a game of dice, the Pandavas and Draupadi went into exile for 12 years, at the end of which, with the help of their cousin, the incarnate god Krishna, who befriended the Pandavas and whose counsel to Arjuna on the battleground, on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, is the famous text called the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord, they regained their kingdom through a cataclysmic battle in which almost everyone on both sides were killed. So it's a happy little story. So what's the deal with this text? Well, its contents are voluminous. And in addition to the main story, which is really what we're only going to be dealing with, there are all these like side quests and other cycles of tales. Some are short, of just a couple of pages. Others go on for the majority of a book. In fact, one of the main texts we're looking at today, the Adi Parvan, I would say at least 60 to 70% of that is just these side stories that aren't about explicitly the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Our lecture today is on the Adi and the, I spelled that wrong, Shalya, Sabha Parvan. So Adi means first, Sabha means like the gathering place. So I'm going to highlight some sort of key stories, but you're going to have to keep track of like the wider details. So doing that, you should use the genealogy charts in the back of here and the glossary in the back of this text to really keep track of who's who and what is going on. Also, either before or after you do your reading or before or after the lecture, you should watch the sections of Peter Brook's Mahabharata that I'll be putting on Blackboard. One, I want to get an idea of what we're going to be looking at today. Somebody actually gave me a copy of this Adi Parvan one time, and so that's just the first chapter, and it's that thick. It's like 4 inches thick. I don't have it with me here in Denver, unfortunately. Okay, so we are watching a film adaptation. It's a film adaptation by Peter Brook, who is an English filmmaker and playwright. He adapted the Mahabharata into a 9-hour stage production. Imagine sitting there for 9 hours. And in fact, one of the reasons why he kept it so long was not only to get a lot of the story in it, but to give people a sense of the vastness, of the hugeness of this text and the grandiosity of its story. He adapted this into a 6-hour movie that we're going to watch today. Now, the movie uses an international cast. Oh, the play was originally in French. Though the text itself is in Sanskrit. The play and the movie used an international cast and had everyone speaking English. The reason for this is to show the universality of the stories. You'll also see that the sets are very, stark. If you see an Indian adaptation of the Mahabharata, it'll always be very lush to give a sense of, sort of the glories of the gods and the people involved. But this adaptation tried to keep it really stark so you would just focus on the characters and the narrative. Now, this was critiqued originally by a lot of Hindus because they said it didn't show the grandiosity of the text, which I think it does, but they meant by the sets, and that the international cast is problematic because it is inherently an Indian story set by Hindus. These days, though, I find more and more younger people in particular really, really like this adaptation. And I think Indians have really come around, Indian Hindus have come around on this text. I think it's excellent. Now, the translation we're reading is not just a translation, but it's an abridgment of our larger text. Chakravarti Vallapalli Narasimhan is the guy who translated our text. Here's a picture of him on the left. Now, he was a freedom fighter and activist before the Indian independence. And after independence, he worked for about 20 years in the Indian civil service, working in finance and economics. After that, he worked for almost another 20 years for the United Nations, and he had a very high posting. So he's not only a scholar, but he is foremostly a diplomat and a great statesman. Now, the text itself that he is working from is this critical edition that was made in Pune. Sometimes they call it the Pune edition. If you look to your right, you'll see these black volumes that are the Mahabharata. There's actually 22, if I remember right, big black books that are this text. Now, if you look to your left, you'll see text that you can't read, and I know it's kind of blurry, but on the top, you'll see the Sanskrit verses, and on the bottom below the line, you'll see all these annotations. Well, what the critical edition did is it looked at hundreds and hundreds of handwritten Sanskrit manuscripts in order to try to find the earliest version of the text that they could construct from all those manuscripts. What you see above the line is what they decided was the oldest version of the text they could pull out of that text. What you see below the line are the variations, the different spellings, the different words, whole verses that just didn't have enough representation in different manuscripts to make it into the full text. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how this text, the critical edition, works. Now, the critical edition is generally what we study when we're studying the Mahabharata, and Narasimhan's text is the closest condensed version of the critical edition, which is steadily being translated around the world right now. I think that this guy is probably the most accessible and the most enjoyable to read. I actually kind of find it kind of riveting, but that's me. Okay, so the Mahabharata is told in a frame story. Well, what's a frame story? A frame story, sort of like Arabian Nights, the Canterbury Tales, or even The Princess Bride, which I have a picture of here, is a set of narratives in which the larger narrative is told. So if you're thinking of The Princess Bride, you have the grandfather who's reading a book to the son. Every now and then the son gets upset and the grandfather pops back out of the narrative and the grandfather says, oh, you're getting upset. Maybe I'll explain this, blah, blah, blah. So that's very much how this frame story works. The frame contracts and recedes. So that at one moment we're hearing about like a side story about all these people, and suddenly someone will ask the narrator, wait, wasn't that the uncle of Arjuna? And he'll say, well, yes, it is. And then he'll tell you a story about Arjuna. And then he'll come back and he'll tell that other story. And somebody will say, well, what about this thing? And then, so the frame of reference changes all the time. But there is one larger frame story that sort of encapsulates the entirety of the text. This is the story of Janamejaya's snake sacrifice. Now, most versions of the Mahabharata, and later versions of the Mahabharata, and this is the version that is in Peter Brooks's tale, tells a story about Vyasa, who is the author, meeting with Ganesha, the elephant-headed god Ganesha, and Ganesha asks him about the Mahabharata. Vyasa starts telling him, and Ganesha says, whoa, 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 hold on, I gotta write this down. So Vyasa is dictating, and Ganesha pulls one of his trunks off. One of his names is Ekadantya, which is the elephant with one trunk, or with one tusk. And he uses the tusk as a stylus to write it down. But this is a later version of the frame story. The older frame story, the one for which the Ganesha story was added, is a story about a sacrifice. So when you think about this, the Mahabharata is, and I'll tell you the frame story in just a second, the Mahabharata is being dictated, is being told in a space in the rituals. Do you remember when we were looking at the Agni Chayana, and I would occasionally say, yeah, there's spots here where people would tell jokes and stories, and poets would recite things. Well, there are all these stops in these giant rituals in which people would tell stories. In many ways, this story, this Mahabharata, is being dictated in the middle of a ritual. Well, what is that ritual? So I will just tell you, I will tell you the story. So Arjuna has a son named Abhimanyu. Abhimanyu, Arjuna, who was born of the wind, is the only Kshatriya to survive the war that will happen, that we're going to read about soon enough. So Abhimanyu has a grandson. Abhimanyu's grandson is Parikshit. So that would make him Abhimanyu's great-great-grandson, or it would make Arjuna's great-great-grandson. So Parikshit is a king, of course, and he goes out hunting, of course, because every time somebody goes hunting in the Mahabharata, well, not every time, but a lot of the times, something bad happens. Bad things happen when you hunt. So he chases a deer through like a thicket, and he finds a sage there meditating. And he asks the sage is named Shringa. He asks him, hey, do you see where that deer went? And the sage just sits there meditating, stoically meditating in his meditative trance. So what happens is Parikshit takes the end of his bow and he picks up a dead snake and he flings it over the shoulder of the sage, who also doesn't move. So this is not only an insult to the sage himself, but it is very defiling because this pure Brahmin has had to touch a corpse, which is a no-no. That puts him into a state of defilement. So it's a grave insult. Parikshit wanders off, continuing to chase the deer. Meanwhile, the ascetic's son, who goes by the name of Shringu, sees his father in this state with the corpse slung over his shoulder, and he's enraged, not just at the ill treatment of his father, but at the sort of ill treatment of Brahmins in general. He's just enraged. So he curses the one who has done this king Parikshit, to die after 7 days, and that he may be killed by the king of the snakes, one Takshaka. So Takshaka, the king of the snakes, is pulled by his own fate, and is pulled by the curse to attack this king. Now, Shringu tells his dad about this, and his dad's like, whoa, that's not good. We got to go warn the king. So they send another Brahmin out there, and the Brahmin tells him what happened. And the king is actually way more upset about insulting Brahmins than he was for the fact that he's going to die very soon. He takes some precautions, namely he builds a fortress on top of a high column, like on a really high platform, so no snakes can climb up, except if you know snakes, they can climb. Anyway, so he builds this high castle on a high platform to avoid the snakes. Now, the snake Takshaka realized that he thinks he can trick the king by what he calls Maya, illusion. So what he does is he and several other snakes dress up like, or disguise themselves, or take on the form of some wandering mendicants, so like monks begging for alms. They go to the king and they give the king some gifts. Hidden in a bowl of fruit is Takshaka, the snake king, who's disguised himself as an insect. As the king, Parikshit, looks at the sort of bowl of fruit, he sees this ugly insect, and he says, it's been 7 days. I've made peace with this. If this is Takshaka, let him reveal himself and kill me. And he does. So Takshaka becomes the big bad snake, kills the king dies. It's horrible. Well, anyway, fast forward. The son of King Parikshit is another king named Janamejaya. He vows revenge on all snakes because the king of snakes killed his father. He in fact decides to do what they call a Sarpa Satra, which means like snake session or a snake sacrifice. Now, this is kind of a made-up ritual. You can't find it in any text that I've come across, whether there's a Vedic text or magic text or anything. But in this snake Sarpa, he gets together a whole bunch of Atharva Veda priests who dress in black and have red eyes. They're all kind of sinister looking. And they start doing this fire sacrifice that pulls snakes from all over the world, all over the entire cosmos, are drawn to this place and compelled to drop into the fire. It's like in one description of it, there was like a whirling ball of snakes mid in the air, and then they just steadily drop down into the flame. So it's terrifying. Now, remember, Indians would be horrified by this. Hindus would be horrified by this because they revere snakes. They don't kill snakes for no reason, one would think. So this would have been horrifying to whomever is hearing it. The sacrifice is ongoing, and then suddenly comes a seer, a rishi, by name of Astika, who is half snake himself. This half snake rishi comes forward, and he hides Takshaka in his robes. So he's got the king snake hidden, and he says, whoa, guys, Janameja, you got to knock this off. This is horrific what we're doing. And in fact, he talks about how one should aspire as a king to be non-cruel, anishramsya, to not do harm unto other beings. And eventually Janameja says, all right, I'll stop, at least temporarily. At this point, the great sacrifices stopped. It's not quite ended. Who should come forward but Vyasa, the author of our story? He comes forward and tells the great tale of the Mahabharata. Why would he tell this tale? In fact, what he's trying to do is he's trying to get this king to be less cruel, to be non-cruel, not necessarily non-violent, to be non-cruel, and what he's doing is cruel. In fact, throughout this book, though, there is a very long section of about 40 chapters just about Astika that tells all sorts of stories about snakes and seers and whatnot. It's a really interesting set of tales. So Vyasa comes forward and tells the story of the Mahabharata to everyone gathered at the ritual. Remember what I was saying. These spaces in the ritual, interruptions in the ritual, are a place to tell stories. So this is a giant and horrible sacrifice that frames the whole tale. And in fact, the last chapters of the Mahabharata return back to Janameja's sacrifice and explain how the sacrifice all ends and does completely stop. After hearing the tale, Janameja is like, okay, I was wrong from the first place to start this thing. This was a bad plan. However, within the tale, we're going to hear that this great war, this great conflict that starts, kills nearly all of the Kshatriyas on earth. In fact, only the Pandava brothers survive and Abhimanyu, Arjuna's grandson. So the war kills everything, but it's often described as being like a sacrificial fire, that all of those lives are being absorbed into the flames. So Vyasa is telling a story to stop cruelty by showing incredible cruelty, but he's also comparing all of the events that happen to a sacrifice and the burning up of life that happens in an animal sacrifice and a fire sacrifice. So one of the intriguing things about the Mahabharata is our main characters are what are called ayonija. Yoni means vulva, ja means bone, born. So born from a vulva is yonija. Ayonija means born not from a vulva, not born from a human womb. So the story starts with a cycle of vows and deaths that I'm not going to go into completely, but we'll start with two kings. There are two kings who are brothers. One is named Dhritarashtra, and he is blind. The other is named Pandu, and he's very, very pale. These two men will sire and give birth to kind of most of the main characters. So Dhritarashtra has married a woman named Gandharvi, and she has bound her eyes, as you see to the left here, because if her husband is going to be blind, then she will be blind too, and she never takes her blindfold off her whole life. Pandu is very pale, and he's also had a curse that if he becomes excessively desirous of his wife, and he's married to two ladies, Kunti and Madri, then he will die. So these are the two sort of problems of these characters. Okay, so from Dhritarashtra will come the clan called the Kauravas, and from Pandu will come the clan called the Pandavas. So first, let's look at the Kauravas. So Dhritarashtra is blind, and his wife has effectively blinded herself. Eventually, with her blindfold, eventually she gets pregnant and she swells up, and for several years she doesn't give birth. So she's like the first of all of them that's pregnant, and she stays pregnant for years. Eventually, she has one of her handmaidens sort of smack her with an iron rod right in the belly, and out rolls a ball that's described as being hard like iron, but also pliable like leather. At this point, Vyasa, our author, once again shows up and says, this is what you do. Cut that up into 100 pieces and put it in 100 jars. She does so, and after about another year, boom, out pops Duryodhana, her oldest son. So she ends up having 100 sons, and actually Indians in general will sometimes refer to this as being the first story about a test tube baby. All right, so now we're going to move on to the Pandavas. When it comes to the Kauravas, Duryodhana, the main prince, is the one you want to remember. He's the main prince. He's also basically the bad guy of the story. So Kunti ends up getting married to Pandu, the brother of Dhritarashtra. Now, Kunti, before she gets married, is a fine and proper woman. And in her youth, she's approached by a very scary ascetic named Durvasa, he who's just absolutely terrifying in appearance. And she's really good to him, and he gives her a gift. He gives her a mantra. That mantra, when she speaks it, will actually bring forth a god, and the god will sire a child upon her. In the Sanskrit, we actually see that the mantra is enlivened and joined with sorcery or abhichara. Abhichara is like murder rituals. So this is kind of odd. Why would you have a ritual or a mantra that brings forth a god to create life connected to sorcery? Well, we'll see that the fate of all of these characters is to lead to the destruction of the entire Kshatriya race. So there is a little bit of killing that goes on in here. So the implications of this is that this mantra will lead to horrible things happening in time. So she tries out this mantra in private, and Surya, the god of the sun, comes to her and sires a child upon her, but he also restores her virginity. Now, what is she going to do? She has this little boy, and he's born with golden earrings and golden armor connected to his skin, like the sun. She puts him in a basket and floats him down a river, and he is found by a charioteer and the charioteer's family, and they adopt him and raise him. At a certain point in his youth, he's approached by the god Indra, who asks for his armor that's connected to his body. And without thinking, this young man, who goes by the name of Karna, and is one of my favorite characters, Karna cuts off all of the armor and he gives it to Indra. And Indra, in return, gives him a terrible weapon, a magical weapon called Shakti, which just means power. And we'll see that Karna's weapon will be used at a later part in this book to a very important end. So Kunti wanders off and she marries Pandu, thinking very little, evidently, of her son Karna. Pandu has been cursed that if he ever becomes impassioned with desire over his wife, then he will die. So Kunti actually tells him about the mantra, and she performs that mantra again. Out of that mantra, first is born Yudhishthira, who I have pictured here in the center. I wanted to give you, for these characters, I wanted to use pictures from sort of Hindi language serials. So these are like, weekly programs that are on all the time that adapt the mythology. So Yudhishthira is born. He is the child of Dharma, Dharma meaning righteousness. Because he is born from Dharma, he is Dharma. He can never tell a lie, except when he does tell a lie a little bit later that moves the plot along. He can never tell a lie, and he's always righteous. When they describe him in Sanskrit, he's described as Yudhishthira, Dharmaraj Yamaraj. So he's the Lord of righteousness, but also the Lord of death. And there are some other arguments and variations that say that he is not only the incarnation of Dharma or the son of Dharma, but the son of death. And we will see that he's going to lead to everybody dying. Then we have Arjuna, who is born from Kunti's mantra. And he is born from Indra, the great warrior god that we've seen. He's the greatest of all warriors, but he's really, really good with sorcery. He is dazzling and bright, but he is very arrogant. Finally, the great Bhima is born. Bhima is large. He is strong. He is powerful. Can't I remember that specifically? I can't remember who is Bhima born from. Sorry, Bhima is born from the wind, Vayu. That's what I thought. Also, Arjuna, or not Arjuna, Hanuman, the monkey god, is born as the son of the wind. He's called Anjaneya. So the wind is considered very powerful in India, which you can experience. So Bhima comes forth, and he's huge. He's much bigger than the other brothers. He's incredibly strong. He is not strategic. He's not very smart. He's easily angered, and he holds grudges, as we shall see. Now, Kunti teaches that mantra to Madri, Pandu's other wife. And Madri bears two sons, Nakula and Sahadeva. Now, these are the incarnation of the Ashwins. The Ashwins are the twins who are horses, or sometimes they're depicted with horse heads. Sometimes they're depicted riding horses. They are physicians. They are knowledgeable about medicine and animal husbandry. Honestly, these guys don't get a lot of play. But there's 5 brothers, and they are all incarnations of God. Eventually, Pandu is overwhelmed with his own sexual desires, and he approaches Madri to have sex with her, and he dies. Now, all of the boys, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, are all trained by a specific teacher named Drona. Drona, in fact, is a Brahmin, but he operates as a warrior. With him operating as a warrior, he has all of the power of a Brahmin's magic and all of the might of a Kshatriya's sort of physicality. Now, the boys are all training with Drona, and they come to the end. And all of them are showing off their incredible powers. And Arjuna in particular shows off his ability to do everything better than everyone. And a stranger shows up. That stranger, in fact, is Karna. And he says, I'm as good as you as anybody. They don't know that they're brothers at this point. And Karna goes ahead and does everything Arjuna can do, maybe even does it better. And then he challenges him to a duel. But Arjuna says, you can't challenge me to a duel. You're not a king. At this point, Duryodhana, the big rival, comes forward and says, I will give him a kingdom. And at this point, Karna says, you gave me a kingdom. I will be your friend and be loyal to you forever. And as we'll see through this, he will learn that he is actually one of the brothers of one of the Pandava brothers, but he never announces his vow to Duryodhana. All right, so we still have a few more characters, and these characters are all very Ayonija. Now, Drona, I told you, is the Brahmin warrior, has a rival whose name is Drupada. Now, once they were friends, but they had a falling out, and they could never reconcile. You should always reconcile with your friends if you have a problem. Anyway, Drupada realizes that he must destroy Drona, but no one can destroy Drona because he's so powerful. So Drupada performs a specific ritual in order to create a child who is capable of killing Drona. And he is also going to usher in the end of the world, effectively. So Drupada gathers together some really sketchy Brahmins known as Yaja and Upayaja. And one of them's a good guy, one of them's kind of sketchy. There's some ambivalence to these characters. So they start doing this ritual, and it works because what appears in the sky, but Drupada's son, Dristadyumna is his name. And Dristadyumna, he appears in a chariot, and they hear a divine voice when he just appears out of nowhere as a result of this ritual. It says, this one will be able to conquer everything. And everybody's really excited because they believe that their clan is going to beat out all the Kauravas and all, and they're good. They're gonna do some butt kicking at this point. However, before everyone's eyes, arising out of the center of the sacrificial circle, out of the Vedi, comes a beautiful woman with incredibly dark skin. And she is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever seen. Her name is Draupadi, the daughter of Drupada. A divine voice says at this time loudly, she will cause the destruction of all the Kshatriyas, of the entire race of people. The ritual audience is so excited about the boy who's going to lead them to victory, they seem to not even recognize that this horrible portent or image and sound and prediction of doom is coming. Anyway, in time, we'll see that Arjuna will win Draupadi in a contest in which everyone is competing to show their skills to get the hand of the woman who is married. He brings her home to show his mother, and he's so excited. He says, look what I have won, mother. And she says, share it with your brothers. And then she looks around and goes, oh my goodness. Well, because she said it, they have to do it. So the 5 brothers marry the one gal, marry Draupadi. And this is somewhat scandalous, but Vyasa comes forward, as usual, and says that there's some precedence for it. So she marries the 5 of them and alternates nights with them throughout the week, and evidently bears each one of them one child. Now, the thing that I wanted you to get about all of this, so see the 5 of them together there, is that heroes and villains in these stories are almost always a yonija. They're somewhat more than human, but they're partially human. They're half human. They have a human parent, but they don't arise in the normal biological way. So in order to be important characters, they have to be somewhat more than human in these tales. Well, what about Krishna? Well, Krishna doesn't have a large part in what we read for today, but he will have a large part coming up. So he has a brother named Balarama, and they are both divine. Now, sometimes they act like normal people that are just really bad hombres, and other times they act like deities. So it's not quite like with Rama, where he's always forgetting that he's divine. But with Krishna, it's like at one point he's a divinity. At one point, he's just like the best friend you could ever have. At other point, he's just the wisest person. He's just the baddest mofo on the planet. So Krishna bonds with Arjuna. And in fact, Arjuna even marries one of his sisters. In time, he becomes really close with all the Pandava brothers, and he will side with them and advise them in the coming conflicts. And he will, in fact, tell them that they must lie, cheat, and steal in order to win, and they must do so because they are on the side of righteousness. Now, Krishna was supposed to be the lord of Western India in an area called Dwarka, which would be near modern Gujarat today. And the thing is, he's beloved by the world. Everybody loves him and thinks he's great. Krishna is going to aid the Pandavas throughout the entire tale and sort of drive the plot. That said, we always wonder what he's up to. Does he really know what's going to happen? Does he allow it? You get the sense in certain parts where he sort of smiles and goes, this is going to end badly, but this is what has to happen. So I always wonder how omniscient Krishna actually is. In time, Krishna becomes one of the most popular gods in India, and you see him everywhere today. Now, we do not see this in this translation, but there's one story that happens at the end of the Adi Parvan, in which Arjuna, Krishna, and Agni go hunting. Of course, this will end badly. And they get so out of hand and intoxicated with the hunt that they burn down an entire forest and all of the animals within it, especially killing a lot of snakes. Perhaps this might be where the snakes' beef with Arjuna and his descendants begin. It's hard to say. The description of this fiery orgy really does parallel the descriptions of fires. So think of the burning of the Khandava forest as being yet another flame sacrifice. Okay, sacrificial imagery is found all over the place. So here we have one more instance of the burning of this forest and all of the inhabitants of it is considered to be parallel to Vedic fire sacrifices. All right, here's some conflicts. This is one of the main conflicts that drives the plot. So while the Kauravas and the Pandavas have had quite a few dust-ups and conflicts as they've been going along, nothing has really divided them. But Duryodhana, the eldest Kaurava, his jealousy, it just grows and grows and grows. And he desires to kill all of the Pandavas by burning them alive, once again realizing he can't beat them in battle. This is a common problem for him. Duryodhana has built a beautiful palace that is made of lac, i.e. made of resins and highly flammable substances. And he invites the Pandavas to live there. And they go, and they live there for a year. But they realize, like, the first night, like, this is a fire trap. Something bad is going to happen. Did they build this to set us on fire? I think so. So they dig an escape tunnel, and they're ready. One night, a woman and her 5 sons comes to visit. And the funny thing about this is the text just says it was their fate for this to happen, but they sure seem like innocent bystanders to me. So Bhima, the strong brother, sets the palace on fire, and then he grabs his siblings and his mother and Draupadi and carries them out through the escape tunnel. The 5 brothers and the 1 woman, in fact, die. Everyone thinks the Pandavas and their daughter and their mother have died there as well. The boys escape to the forest where they wander and study the Vedas and weaponry with all the different sort of ascetics they find there. Remember, they go to the forest, but they're going to a wilderness, but there's lots of people there. There's talking animals, there's ascetics doing practices, there's like martial arts masters. When you get into the wilderness, that's where wisdom, wildness, and power can come from. But you have to go there, and it is dangerous and ambivalent. So once again, they're thought to be dead, and they go into exile. We'll see this happen often. You remember that the Ramayana is a story of Rama going into exile. Here is the first time the boys are in exile. They are wandering in the forest for a good long while, not years, but they're out for a long time while everybody thinks they're dead. While they're out there, Bhima is hanging out one night, keeping an eye on things while everybody else sleeps, and a Rakshasi, a demoness named Hidimba, or Hidimbi, depending on what you look at, sees him and becomes just enraptured with him. Now, Rakshasas eat human flesh. So her brother wants her to go in and trick them so they can come and, eat all of the Pandava brothers. Unfortunately for him, Bhima wakes up, starts chatting with this gal, and they like each other quite a bit. The brother runs forward, and Bhima just beats him to a tar. And in the minute he looks sort of weary, he just crushes him to the ground and kills him. So Hidimba and Bhima sort of get married. Yudhishthira says, look, my brother is a little wild, but you can have him, but you have to bring him back. I don't want you to take him to the land of the Rakshasis and have him live out the rest of his eternity as a Rakshasi. So you can have him every night, but we get him back every day. So Bhima and Hidimba wander off and sport wildly, and they have a child named Gatotkacha. Gatotkacha is half Bhima, so half son of the wind, and half Rakshasa. He will come forward later. He's supposed to have a giant body, be shaven-headed, and just be ferocious. We will see him later in a battle conflict that is important. What's the takeaway here? The wilderness is a place of danger and wisdom. We saw earlier, but I didn't talk about it, Arjuna went on a pilgrimage for many years where he ended up meeting Krishna. He ended up meeting Krishna's sister that he was going to marry. He learned a whole bunch of magical weapons. He married a whole bunch of celestial nymphs. So when somebody goes into the forest, whether they're forced to in exile or whether they choose to, they have the chance to encounter wisdom and danger. Now, Bhima himself, by virtue of being so strong and wild, he's a little bit of a Rakshasa himself. He has a wildness to him. So in a sense, we can see that anyone that has that wildness, that wilderness in them is also powerful and dangerous. All right, the dice match. So we're out of the Adi Parvan and we're into the Sabha Parvan. We're getting toward the end of our class today. Yudhishthira is known for having a flaw. Yudhishthira is wise, he is truthful, but he is addicted to gambling and he's not a very good gambler. Now, let's also remember that he can't lie. Part of being Dharma Raja, Yama Raja, is that he cannot tell a lie. And what we see when we look at gambling and dice rolling in different places, we see that part of the game is to lie, to kind of sneakily count all your dice really fast and give the wrong number. Part of the skill in gambling is lying, and he cannot lie. That's one way to put it. I like to think of it that way. Anyway, Duryodhana cooks up this plan to challenge Yudhishthira to a dice match, knowing that, Duryodhana can't beat him physically, and knowing that Yudhishthira will become crazed and will have to keep betting no matter what, and he'll make bad bets. Now, Duryodhana's uncle is named Shakuni, and he's a master gambler, and he's a great cheat. But like I said, you're supposed to cheat. And in this dice match, and this is a little sketchy here, Duryodhana isn't going to play dice against Yudhishthira. Shakuni is. This is not going to go well. The games begin, and Shakuni beats Yudhishthira at every turn. First, he loses his jewelry. Then he loses his wealth. Then he stakes his kingdom, and he loses that. Shakuni says, you've got more. What about your brothers? He loses all his brothers. What about yourself? You can become a slave. And he loses that. And then what about Draupadi? So he stakes Draupadi, and he loses again. He's lost everything. And he's even lost his wife and his freedom. Everything is gone. At this point, Duryodhana sends his brother Dushasana, this is kind of important, to go get Draupadi and make her come here and be his maid. Draupadi shows up, and it does not go well for Dushasana. He's really rough with her, and he's rude to her, and he's crude to her. So Draupadi shows up, and she says, "You can't, Yudhishthira. When did you lose yourself? Was it before you lost me?" Yeah. Well, then I'm not lost because you'd lost yourself, so you can't stake me. At this point, Dushasana tries to disrobe her. You see this on the left. And he's pulling on her cloth and pulling on her cloth. And this is great in the movie. And more cloth is coming. More and more cloth is coming. In the earliest of the texts, it's just a miracle that's about her purity. In later texts, she prays to Krishna, and Krishna does the miracle. Now, this did not go well, but Duryodhana is still going to be a jerk. He whips out his right thigh and says, "Come sit on my right thigh," which in Indian parlance is kind of basically like saying, "Why don't you come here and have sex with me?" At this point, everybody is just horrified. The king, who's the father to the Kauravas, Dhritarashtra, is just horrified. Everyone around is just appalled. Draupadi turns and looks and says, Dushasana, I will wash my hair in your blood. And Bhima says, I will drink your blood. And then Bhima turns to Duryodhana and he says to him, I will break your legs. I will break that thigh. And in fact, there's a battle later where he will break Duryodhana's thighs and kill him. But he does it by cheating at battle and striking a low blow. Anyway, so enough is enough. Dhritarashtra turns to Draupadi and says, you're right. He couldn't have bet you. I'll give you a wish. And she wishes to get all her wealth and her husband's back. And they leave on their merry way. Unfortunately, Shakuni and Duryodhana have one last trick. They call the Pandavas back for one more dice roll. And they are, for some reason, compelled to do so by fate or by addiction to gambling on the part of Yudhishthira. And they lose again. I'll say that in a second. So anyway, they get called back to play this one last game of dice. The last wager is that the losers will have to go into exile for 12 years, living in the forest. Then on the 13th year, they will have to return to the kingdom and live in disguise for a full year. Now, Duryodhana sort of figures that after all this time, the Pandavas will be reduced and his kingdom will be so much stronger and he'll be easily able to physically overwhelm them at this point. This is not gonna work out for him. This is gonna screw him over later. We'll see. The Pandavas and Draupadi leave for the forest, leaving their parents, leaving their other family members behind. Even Kunti stays behind with the Kauravas. So like in the Ramayana, exile drives the story. Now, we've seen a lot of conflicts. We've seen an absolute ton of conflicts between urban and rural, the kingdom and the wilderness, between the various people and characters, between Brahmins and Kshatriyas, which we'll talk more about, and between, moreover, violence and restraint. We've seen that fate forces things. It's as if Yudhishthira knew he was going to lose everything, but he was fated to do so, so he couldn't stop it. The woman who was burned up with her sons in the house of Lac was compelled by fate. So fate runs through this narrative. I had an Indian pal, an old kind of cranky guy, who would always turn to me and say, the thing you don't understand about the Mahabharata, Aaron, or Arjun, I go by Arjuna, in fact. The thing you don't understand about the Mahabharata, Arjun, is that it's really about Krishna and Shakuni. Because he says that in the text, and I haven't really looked at this, every time Shakuni does something, when he rolls a dice and he sets up a plan, he looks at Krishna and Krishna looks at him. And they sort of smile at one another because this is the way it has to be. There's no way out of this. And without the dice match, then none of the other crazy things that are going to happen can happen. So there's this argument that perhaps Krishna and Shakuni masterminded this whole thing. To what end? I'm not sure. All right, as we're moving forward, I want you to read Doniger to kind of understand and nuance the story. She's pretty lively and pretty light here. Read the translation. Make sure you've read that before class. And I want you to watch the adaptations from Peter Brook that I'm going to put on in our lessons. They're fun. I like them. I one time had the full 6 hours on videotape and I made my sister watch it. We just sat one Saturday and watched the whole 6 hours of it. She and I still talk about it every now and then. But more and more, I want you to enjoy this story and let your mind wander. Who are these characters? Are they universal? Do these people remind you of anything? Do these events remind you of anything? Why do I, Dr. Ulrich, insist that this is the greatest story ever told? Because it is. It's so much better than the Ramayana. It's better than every other epic. This is just such a great story. So that's the end. Welcome to the Mahabharata unit. We're going to do this a couple more times. I hope you enjoy it. Enjoy the reading and enjoy the video adaptations.